Okay, I want to tell you, before we take this over to the sewing machine, after all your squares are ironed down and you like where they all are, this is when I like to give it a really good pressing so that all of these squares are really nice and secure. You don't want to have any that are lifting up. So that's why I brought in the big iron. Sometimes that works best because you can use some steam and you don't need to use the applique pressing sheet at this point. You're just going to give this some really nice steam. So when we are ready to sew, you are going to fold right sides together, and then we're going to sew our 1/4 inch seam. So let's come over to the sewing machine. I have the 1/4 inch piecing foot on the sewing machine right now, and just a nice little neutral color of thread. I like to start out the seam a little bit slow, start out that sewing, and I do like to do a little back stitch at the beginning. Now, the 1/4 inch seams that I sew might be a little bit different than the 1/4 inch seam that you sew. But the key is to just make sure that those seams are nice and consistent. That's what we're looking for, is nice, consistent seam allowances throughout. So here's our next seam. We're going to fold right sides together. Isn't this fun to sew with no pins? What we want to do is make sure that that fold line, that little dotted line, is right along that fold. And again, we're going to start out a little bit slow and do a little back stitch in here. And now off we go. I like to just double check. I can double check that that dotted line is along the fold. And I'm going to sew this 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Now we're going to continue to sew in one direction through this whole panel. And I like to sew the short seams first. So those are the ones that I'm working on. We're going to sew all the way down on those short seams. Okay, now I am on my last row. Wasn't that fast? We're going to come on down to the end of this row. When I like to do the back stitch at the beginning, and when I get to the end, I just run right off. Usually there's nice secure stitching right up to the end, so I don't worry about back stitching. Okay, so now we have sewn, I'm going to turn it over so you can see, we have sewn the vertical lines across the whole table runner. And all of those are sewn in one direction. So now what we're seeing are rectangles. So our next step is we are going to clip in between each of those squares right up to the stitching line. Remember when we kind of talked about the little X that defines each of those squares? Well, when that's folded in half, it looks like a little tick mark. So we're going to clip right in between each of these squares, right up to your stitching line. Now, if you happen to snip through that sewing line, don't worry, because everything is held together by that foundation. And you also are going to be sewing in the other direction. So we're going to just keep on snipping, and then we're going to do some pressing. All right, we're going to finish clipping this row. So now we have clipped the seams, clipped the seam allowance. And the reason that we are doing this clipping is so that we can press seam allowances going opposite directions. And the easiest way I have found to do this is we're going to press these one row at a time. So this is when I like to use the big iron. I like to have some steam going on this. And we're going to do this first row. See how I'm kind of giving this just a little tug here, because I want these to be flat. You can kind of hear that steam a little bit all the way through. And just slide it down. Keep on going. And if you need to, you can kind of hold that down a little bit. We're just not really going to go back and forth. We're just going in one direction. So now that first row is all pressed in one direction, and then I fold that row underneath like that. And we're going to turn our whole runner around. Now we're on the second row, and we're going to press this going in the opposite direction. Just want to show you while I first started. So here's the first row going in this direction. So now we've turned it over, and we're pressing this row in the opposite direction. See how nice those lay nice and flat because we have done all that clipping. So the clipping is a really important part of this whole process. Let's finish out this row. See how I give that a little bit of tug. Like that. So now I'm going to fold. Now we're going to fold both of those rows under. See how nice that looks? They're going opposite. So fold both of those rows underneath. I'm making sure that this is folded along that fold line. Again, I'm right-handed, so that's why I'm turning this over. So I'm pressing from right to left. And so you can do this going in the opposite direction if that's easier for you. Okay, we're gonna get that steam. See how nice that steam really helps that to lay nice and flat. And because this is all stabilized by the foundation, sometimes piecers don't like to use steam because they feel like it'll stretch the fabric out. But because this is all stabilized, this is all gonna stay nice and in place. So fold that row under, and we're gonna just continue on. All right, we are pressing our last row of seam allowances all the way through. Now, when this is all finished on the back, I just want to show you how awesome that back looks. So do you see how all those seam allowances are going opposite directions? That's some pretty piecing. Now, before we sew the other direction, I like to turn it over because one thing that's really easy to happen after we press it the first way, it's really easy for there to be some little extra folds in these fabrics where maybe these did not get flattened out really well. So I like to turn it over, and with the steam on, I kind of like to call this hover pressing, and I'm not pressing the iron down really hard. I'm just kind of hovering over this, definitely using the steam, and I just want to make sure these are nice and flattened out. Move that down. Look at that. There's a whole table runner coming together. So if you need to, you can give that just a little gentle tug. Just hover that nice iron steam across. Okay, that looks great. Move that over here. So now, this is my favorite part. It's time to fold right sides together going the other direction. And this is what I want you to notice, is look at how nicely these seams nest together perfectly. So there's no adjusting, there's no pinning. These are just right where they're supposed to be. So now, with right sides together, we're gonna bring this over to the sewing machine. Now again, when we first start out, I like to start out slow. And I like to do just a little back stitch. Again, sewing that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, when you're sewing this second seam, I do like to double check that those seam allowances stay in the direction that they're supposed to as you're sewing along. So again, no pins. Isn't that nice how those are just feeding right through? Coming up to the end. Now on the end, I'm just going to sew right off of that end and cut that. All right, so now right sides together. Now one thing I want to just mention, sometimes right after the first row, we fold that second row, and it's really easy to get this first row caught in that seam allowance. So as you're folding that second row over, just make sure that this is open and you get both of those folded nice and flat. And we're going to bring that over, making sure that that dotted line is right on the edge. Our little back stitch. Now on this one, the seam allowance is going the opposite way. So the underneath seam wants to fold this way, but it's actually supposed to be folding up. So as you go through, I kind of lift that up just a little bit. You're just double checking, making sure that seam allowance is facing the correct direction. And then again, making sure that that row that we sewed is out of the way, and off you go. All right, we are sewing the last row of our second seam. And so again, just double checking for those seam allowances, making sure that that is facing the right way. 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way through. Now one thing to note about seam allowances is that, as I said in the beginning, this is a 1.5 inch finished square. But I tend to sew more of a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, where you might sew more of a full 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is great, but what's going to happen is my finished square might be slightly different size than your finished square, and that's okay. Like I said, just as long as these seam allowances are consistent. So what I want you to notice is look at how nice all those corners are matching up. And let's check out the back here. See how nice that looks? Okay, so after we have sewn the second seam throughout the whole runner, we are going to, let's put the iron over on this right side. Just like to give that a good shake. And then all the seam allowances are just going to be pressed in one direction. It doesn't matter which direction. For me, going from right to left, it's just easy to press these seams away. So notice again, I've got the steam, giving this a little bit of a tug as we press through this table runner. Let's slide it down. And there's not very often where we have a quilt piecing project where the back looks almost as nice as the front. This is another really nice feature of piecing on a foundation, is these fabrics are stabilized. I mean, can you imagine how stretchy this would be if it was just our fabric? The other thing I want you to notice is that we don't have any raw edges. We don't have any extra threads around, no raw edges. It's a really great stabilized finished back. Okay, now we are going to do the same thing as we did on the first one. After you press the back, all those seams going in one direction, then let's turn it over. I'm going to put glasses on for this one so I can see. Isn't that pretty? This actually lets us see these beautiful matching corners now that we've done some pressing. But this is where we're going to do our glide steam pressing. We just want to make sure that these are nice and flattened out. This is a good example right here. So do you see how we have a little bit of a little fold? That's really easy to have happen, especially, it seems like especially on that last row. So give that a little tug, get that iron in there, get that nice and pressed all the way through. Now, if you were doing, well, this project or even a bigger quilt, there are a lot of seams in this project, and even when we're piecing on a foundation, it would be really easy for one side of this to be a different length than the other side, just because of the pressing, not because of the way you're sewing it, but because there are so many seam allowances and seams in this project. So I have a little way to double check that this is going to be a nice, square, flat project. Okay, beautiful. All right, so after you're done, I like to just take the ends and I bring this up and I'm just matching up these two ends just to see if they're basically the same length, and they are. And then you can take the other side, the long side, and just fold those to here. Let's move that iron up a little bit. So then we're just going to fold this. And this is just going to let us know how we've done on our pressing. So if these are the same length, then you've done a perfect job on your pressing. So our table runner top is all finished and we are ready for borders.